Ladies and gentlemen, let's Red Gaming Silicon video. We're going to be discussing a recent interview with Crytek, who are of course not only involved in the next generation's Ryse, which is exclusive to the Xbox One, but also they've been discussing their thoughts and opinions on the next generation of consoles as a whole and how they stack up to the PC. So of course I will not just be reading out the interview, I'll also be giving a breakdown of the technical jargon. I'll be citing numerous sources which will help to explain other things from other developers as well. I'll also be giving my thoughts and opinions on it and much more besides. Now, as a slight aside before we completely jump in, I know I've been slacking a little bit in terms of videos the past few days. I can only apologise profusely. Not only are we a man down, if you will, on the channel the last couple of days because Amata, she's in London at the moment doing some filming and so on for the Comic-Con Expo, but also in addition to that I've had electricians around my home and they've basically left it in a hovels because I had to have it completely rewired. So the website move and other things that I've had kind of on the back burner has been, well, actually in the process of doing, has had to be put on the back burner. But this weekend I'm basically working flat out to try and get everything done. I've actually taken a day off work to try and catch up for you guys on Monday. So anyway, let us begin, my good friends. So the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 have come under a lot of scrutiny. So the question was asked, with Crytek being of course the developers of the CryEngine series. They're no longer, by the way, adding incremental numbers to CryEngine. You may be aware that, for example, they had CryEngine 2, CryEngine 3. They're no longer saying 2, 3, 4. They're actually just incrementing the version and then giving that away to developers. Much like, say, Epic, who are giving away, or loaning, should I say, the technologies of the Unreal Engine, or say id with the id Tech engines or whatever. But Crytek now are simply providing the latest versions for developers, so it's no longer incremented. I don't know if I necessarily like that, but whatever. So anyway, Cevat Yerli, who has been the man who's been interviewed, said, and I quote, "Both consoles have a DX 11.1 plus capable GPU with full compute shader support, which allows us to come up with new creative rendering techniques that were not possible before. The GPU are very efficient at performing math operations, and the CPU, in contrast with the previous PowerPC based architectures, have standard PC features like out-of-order executions and branch prediction." I will go into this stuff in a moment, my friends. All this reduces all need for micro-optimizations, allow us to focus more on high-level algorithms, which usually has more rewarding part of development. We also look forward to seeing what the PlayStation 4 will offer in regards to online compute capabilities, and the strategy rolled out by the Xbox One's cloud support is certainly going to be very interesting in terms of compute power for the next generation games. I also think the Microsoft decision to include Kinect as a standard is a positive one, as it avoids fragmenting the market and allows developers to treat its functionality as a given. So I guess the first place we're going to start in doing this analysis would be the consoles. So we're not going to discuss the specific specifications of them. Not only has that been said quite a bit, I probably will cover it a little bit later, but both systems do have a DX 11.1 capable. Now, that is not to say the PS4 uses DX 11. It's actually using OpenGL with the PlayStation shader language. It's actually very similar-ish to Mantle, as far as I'm understanding as well. As for the out-of-order and PowerPC, previously both the PlayStation 3, which was using Cell, and the Xbox 360, which was using Xenos, were both PowerPC architectures. Now, they have some benefits, such as the fact that you actually can cram in more registers. So despite the fact that, for example, the processors, the Xbox 360 and the Xbox One's CPU in terms of raw performance is pretty much identical. There's not that much difference in raw G-flops, and the actual major plus is that, first of all, it's x86-64. That means, of course, you can address more than 4 gigs of RAM, plus you have access to a lot more simpler instructions. By the way, if you want a lot more information on this, you can actually check out, and you're wondering about the major differences between PowerPC and so on, you can actually check out a video and article I've got on Red Gaming Tech. It would be the PlayStation 3 post-mortem. So you could just type in PlayStation 3 post-mortem on the channel and it'll come up with quite a lot of stuff. I've gone and really broken down what PowerPC architecture is versus x86. So out-of-order execution versus in-order execution, which was the PowerPC, and cell. This is primarily to do with the fact that and branch predictor. This is pretty much to do with the way that it handles instructions, and you find that if an instruction comes in an order that the processor wasn't necessarily expecting and the compiler wasn't necessarily telling it would be at, it can sometimes hang a moment and therefore cause one of the hardware threads to basically perform crapper than what it should do. Crapper is, by the way, a technical term. Also, they spoke about memory. Now, memory, and we're not discussing the performance here because they've not gotten to that yet, but what they are talking about is the amount. Previously, both systems had 512 megabytes of memory. That's not inclusive of overheads. The PS3's overheads, for example, they managed to get down some from an update with the system. They managed to claw back a reasonable amount of RAM. But even so, it wasn't exactly quite a lot. And so Cevat has replied, I'm really hoping I've pronounced his name correctly anyway, the available memory is a massive improvement compared to the less than 512 we had before, and makes life a lot easier, but despite this improved streaming system, we've still filled it up quite easily and had to eventually work on optimizing asset sizes. So that just gives you an idea, out of quote, that gives you just an idea of how memory hungry some applications will be. I'm not quite sure how they were putting stuff together, because just a while back, John Carmack was speaking about that he doesn't believe that the PlayStation 4 from 4 to 8 gigs was actually that big of a deal. And anyway, the titles he's creating, he believes that 4 gigs probably would have been enough. Now, both systems, I'd like to point out, have quite a substantial amount of RAM that is being allocated to other things, which would be operating system functionality in effect. So anyway, now in terms of the process of moving the engine, the CryEngine, to the consoles, Cevat actually replied, the transition to the next generation is going smoothly, although the workflow and tools are still in their early stages, and they are better at this point than they were in the earlier life cycle last generation. In other words, he's saying the previous generations worked, the tools, the debuggers and everything else kind of sucked, which is true, especially, may I add, from Sony, which is fairly infamous, by the way, in the industry. Back to quote, due to the improved specs and familiar PC-style development environment, many developers have received a welcome overall improvement. This hasn't really been beneficial. This has really been beneficial and has freed up a lot more time just getting the best out of the system. Not exactly new wording there. So, the question was raised, what about the GPU and the wider bandwidth for the PlayStation 4? Does it make it more powerful than the Xbox One? What's your assessment? Unfortunately, this is a bit of a PR answer. It's not what I'd consider to be an honest answer. He replied, both next-gen platforms have excellent specs and provides wins against each other in a variety of areas, but in essence both of them are going to run the next generation games in more or less the same quality due to diminishing returns on optimizing for those little differences. That being said, platform exclusive titles may be able to take advantage of these slight variations on the Xbox One and PlayStation 4. I'm actually not particularly super happy with that answer. I would have preferred slightly more in depth. There is a trend right now with certain developers, and the problem is, and this has been something that no doubt you guys have, and girls probably, have been at the front end of as well. And that is quite simply that everyone is giving a different answer, yeah? And some of it is PR. Second, some of it is to do with the fact that, in a very simple way to put it, everyone's needs are different. In other words, the way you write an engine or the needs of your engine may be completely different to the needs of John's, or might be different to Samantha's, and theirs might be the difference to Bill. And even if, let's assume we're all using the Unreal Engine, that's completely diminished that. But what you're doing with the Unreal Engine, what your optimizations are, and so on are completely different. For example, take a look at, say, Arkham Origins, or any of the Arkham games. They are running the Unreal Engine. It's heavily modified, but they're still using it. But also the Unreal Engine, of course, can be used for, well, FPS games, driving games, much more. So, I have heard of some developers stating that once the Xbox One's ESRAM and hardware specs are understood better, it's going to be a lot easier to develop for. But I'm going to go into that heavily in a different video because it is a ridiculously lengthy subject in and of itself, and I would basically sabotage this video to just speak about that. They were also asked about the PlayStation 4's compute, and would it be able to be explored in a multi-platform development environment. The answer was GPU compute is definitely the future. The CPU performance is better than last gen, but not by a huge margin, and the GPU, on the other hand, is really sizable improvement. If the tasks are suited for it, moving to the GPU can be an incredible performance win. However, this is taking away performance from traditional graphics pipeline, so there's a limit to what you can put on the GPU. As for the broader multi-platform question, supporting GPU compute isn't really that much different from supporting multi-platform rendering, so it's certainly something that we'll be using more and more on all platforms. Now, obviously, with the PlayStation 4, it has a significantly improved compute structure compared to the Xbox One's. As some regular viewers may know, or you may know regardless, the volcanic islands, also known as the R9-290X and so on, that's not the other R9. So, for example, if you look at the R9-280X and so on, forget it. It doesn't have it. It's only the R9-290 from AMD. They actually utilize many of the same components as the GPU for the PlayStation 4. That doesn't mean that the PlayStation 4's GPU is volcanic islands. What it does mean is that Sony basically requested some certain changes for the volcanic for their own GPU, and then those, as far as the rumors go, AMD are not confirming this. However, developers who work at AMD have kind of hinted this. They've not confirmed it, they've hinted. But basically, AMD took those modifications that Sony used and then implemented them onto their own discrete graphics solutions. Regardless of which, there's 64 compute queues. However, a queue, and this is the important part, a queue is not the same thing as, workers. In other words, they still need to be processed by the stream processors. Now, there's 1152 of those on the PlayStation 4. That's 64 times 18, in case you're wondering how that math comes about. That's 64 stream processors per one GCN core, and there's 18 GCN cores on the PlayStation 4, giving you, of course, 1.84 teraflops of performance. But the ACE engines basically act as the compute queues basically store instructions, right? So they'll store that instruction and then they'll process it on the stream processor. Now, I've got a lot more on this on an article I've done on RGT, which is known as PlayStation 4 GPU and Next-Gen AMD Radeon Volcanic Island GPU Compute Similarities. And it's also a video. So if you want, you could type in PlayStation 4 and Volcanic Islands on the channel, and you will get a lot more information than what I can put in here. I promise you, it is not just simply so I can get more views of me saying this stuff. It's honestly because it's a ridiculously complicated subject. I don't just want to turn this into like a 50,000 part video because the end result is exactly the same. It just forces people who have already know about the stuff to basically listen to it. So I prefer to just let you go out and do your own research. You can either Google it or you can just go what I've written up, and I've got all the sources there, so it's probably easier, but it's up to you entirely, of course. So the bottom line is how they basically do it, in theory anyway. In theory is obviously not the same thing as practice, but, well, generally, they kind of mash up, but the theory is that a compute command will render or be executed when the GPU is at a portion of the frame that's not so busy. So let's assume that a portion of a frame isn't so busy. It's doing, something that's not too taxing. Okay, I've got 70% of my GPU resources freed up. That leaves 30%. I can dedicate that to compute. The problem is, obviously, that's not always the case. So sometimes there are going to be issues, and you can't just keep piling the workload up. However, I imagine that there are going to be specific times where it's certainly going to be extremely beneficial to do so. I think that developers are certainly going to need to do a balancing act. So what about the Jaguar? Now, the Jaguar itself, just to give you guys an idea, is basically two low-powered laptop and mobile CPUs. It's basically the case, right? There's a bridge between the two cores, and that bridge allows well, actually they're not cores, they're modules, I'm sorry, because each module has 4 cores. So there's a bridge between the two modules, effectively. It's not technically a bridge, but you know what I mean, it's communication, so that Module A can talk to Module B, so that Module B knows what Module A is processing, and vice versa. They are not particularly high-end in terms of, if you compare them to consoles, to high-end PCs. But anyway, the reply was, an infinitely fast single-core CPU running the games single-threaded would obviously have made things simpler. However, these days have long since gone, and those days, I'm sorry, my god, these days have long since gone, and the engines are required and scale well across multiple CPU's cores for games to run fast at high-end quality. That is, they need to be able to execute multiple jobs concurrently without introducing significant wait times and synchronization costs. Ryse 3 has been doing that well in that regard, and it further improved over time for Ryse in particular because of the lower CPU clock rate are acceptable as long as there are enough cores available to offload the workload throughout our job systems. He also added that AMD's involvement on the next generation consoles will improve its performance in PC gaming, but he still believes that Intel will most likely have an advantage. That's because Intel typically considerably faster clock for clock. However, obviously there are certain processors available for the PC which are pretty damn good from AMD. That's why I'm saying you can actually produce a really good gaming PC for pretty cheap now. There's some really good parts out there. You can easily make a ridiculously powerful system for about $650. Maybe about £500-ish, and that system will easily be able to play all the next-gen games at like 1080p. Or if you spend a little bit more, you can certainly get a lot more performance. So the basic premise behind this is that multi-cores are just the way to go now. There's multiple reasons for it. It's actually cheaper in terms of power consumption, and that might sound odd. That might sound like I'm trying to speak to you in Vulcan or something, but the reality of the matter is that it's actually cheaper in terms of power usage and actually heat generated to go multi-core now. That's why even your cell phone actually has multi-core processors. The bottom line is that the problem with it is that games traditionally have struggled to be multi-core, to be multi-threaded. It's becoming less of a concern now, and obviously the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 help that. The Xbox 360 in particular had 6 threads. The PS3 actually had 2 main hardware threads, but it could run a lot of code on the SPEs, which were known as the synergistic processing elements. But for PCs, it didn't really start that well. There were certainly some games that did heavily favor multi-core processing, but it hasn't been until recently that certain games have really started to take advantage of, say, 4 cores or 6 cores or whatever. Now, what about 60 frames versus 30 frames per second? If there's anything that's probably been, I would say the most controversial, actually. I would actually go the most controversial. I've put out a couple of videos on 1080p versus 60 frames a second, and 60 frames a second versus 720 at 60 or 1080 at 30 and so on, and it's pretty unanimous that most of you guys expected 1080p at 60 especially. And let's move on about this. So developers, this is according to Cevat, developers always have to choose whether they're going for 60 or 30 frames a second depending on the type of game and complexity of the project. With Ryse, we wanted to go in very emotional experience and complex and dramatic lighting, high fidelity environments, and rich character and character animation. So 30 FPS was our choice, and we believe that most developers will go for richer worlds at 30 rather than 60, which would call for compromises as 60 demands twice the amount of compute rendering speed. 30 FPS is a standard that is above, for example, what most cinemas use for showing films. Early demos with high frame rate experiences shown that gamers and viewers have a mixed opinion about perceived quality. For example, how 48 FPS cinema experiences were received, so both production design choice as well as user research. I don't like that answer. I'm just going to be completely honest. First of all, games developers need to choose 30 or 60 because of hardware. Not because of any other reason, despite what he's saying. If this was on PC, and I'm not saying this to be a PC, game, woohoo and all. I'm just saying, the bottom line is, if this was on PC, it would, you could run it whatever resolution you would want, as long as there wasn't a locked frame rate, which I dislike, by the way, as long as the game's running over 60. Similarly, if the Xbox One was significantly more powerful, let's just go into Magical Fantasy Land of 3 times more powerful, you could possibly bet that it would be running at 60. So it's not a choice because of any other reason, it's just limited hardware. So in other words, what they do, they say to themselves, okay, we need X, we can't get X graphics and X speed with Y hardware, so something has to give. It's as simple as that, right? Now, and it's true though, twice the rendering performance. So that means basically the GPU, when you're saying that you're going to have 30 FPS, it's pretty much saying that the GPU is going to have twice as long, literally twice as long, to render each individual frame of animation. All you have to do, by the way, to get a breakdown of this is you type in 1000. 1000 would equal to be milliseconds, and then you divide that by the target frame rate. So, for example, I'm going to be doing this with you guys. 1000, yes, I'm typing it into a calculator just for the sake of it, because it sounds cool and all, times 60 equals 16.6. Obviously, if we were to do exactly the same thing, obviously we can work this out in our heads, but we'll just do it anyway. 1000 divided by 30, which is the target frame rate. So 1000, by the way, is milliseconds, and 30 would be the frame rate. And if we were to press equals on that, you get 33.3. So in other words, you get 33.3 milliseconds to basically render a frame if you're targeting 30 FPS. Pretty simple stuff, not complicated. In other words, the more work the GPU is doing, the bigger the workload, the longer the workmen take to calculate the stuff, right? It's like a pretty simple thing. If you're carrying a massive load of items, then it takes a lot longer to do it than, say, a smaller load. Pretty simple. So, in this case, what about the cinematic experience? Now, I have actually done a video on this, which is 30 versus 60 frames a second in resolution. I've gone into this a lot, but the problem with 30 is that some games just don't work with it. Why do you think that the guys behind Killer Instinct, for example, or any fighting game actually, always go for 60. It's not because it's a fun number, it's because that certain games, it introduces latency, and therefore you get basically latency in the controls, and that's not good. It basically pisses away your timing. Certain games work pretty well with it. I think this game works fine. I'm not disputing it works with the technology. I'm just saying that their title is very cinematic. It has a lot of QTEs and so on. fine. But for something else, I don't necessarily agree with the opinion. I'm not saying he's spouting rubbish, I'm just saying I don't necessarily agree with it. I think that if we were playing Crysis at 30 frames a second, it would not feel anywhere near as good as 60. You can actually do these checks yourself, by the way. If you happen to have a gaming PC, you could put on some frame rate limiters on a particular game, and you could basically check them out yourself. As someone who regularly plays on PC, I've done these tests and I personally notice it quite well. I'm not saying that all games require it, but certain games certainly do. Anyway, that's it for this particular part, because I still have to edit, I still have to cover other news and much more besides. Hopefully the second part shall be up tomorrow. And much more besides. So anyway, I'm gonna get going. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video, my good friends. I'll see you soon. By the way, if you've got any questions or comments, you can contact me directly on Facebook, facebook.com/RedGamingTech. You can ask for me specifically, that would be Paul or Crimson Rain. Do note that I am swamped at the moment, not just from messages from you guys, which I do appreciate, but also, unfortunately for myself, as I said, basically I need to do tons of furniture moving. I have the gym tomorrow as well, and I have to move a website. I'm doing some research on some of projects for you guys and much more, so the next couple of days are going to be basically a nightmare for me. But as I said, I'm taking Monday off work to try and get some of the stuff sorted out for RGT. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.